And today, a lot of nations are fighting for their survival, sovereignty, and peace. And the Sahel region is part of the area feeling heavy pressure and influence of imperialism.
A storm just broke in Africa. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has accused France of using African soldiers in secret nuclear experiments, of brainwashing entire nations through the media, and of rewriting African history to erase the truth. If that's true, what else have they hidden? And why is Traoré revealing it now? Let's find out. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the Burkinabe youth and uttered the words, "They used our bodies to measure death," many didn't know what he meant, but those who did went quiet. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a reference to something almost no one in Africa had been told, the day France tested nuclear bombs on African men and called it science. In the 1960s, as France rushed to join the atomic powers of the Cold War, it carried out a series of nuclear tests in the Sahara Desert of Algeria. What history books often omit is that alongside the warheads, tanks, and blast shelters were African conscripts, young soldiers taken from colonies like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. They were brought to the desert not for training or defense, but as living data points. Traoré has now revealed, with growing archival evidence, that these men were made to march across radioactive sand within hours of detonation. No protective suits, no explanation, just orders. Some were told to observe the flash from a trench. Others were told to walk upright across the fallout zone as officers took notes from a distance. Their reactions, symptoms, and breakdowns were all recorded. They weren't soldiers, they were subjects, human lab rats in a colonial science experiment. Many never returned. Those who did suffer quietly. In villages across Burkina Faso, stories linger of men who came back with their skin burned, their bones aching, their sleep haunted. Cancer took some. Silence took the rest. And the French government? It said nothing. It paid nothing. It denied everything. The real crime, Traoré says, isn't just what happened in the desert, but what happened afterward. These events were buried, not just in French archives, but in African memory. School books said nothing. Oral tradition was silenced by shame, disbelief, and the deliberate rewriting of history. Entire generations grew up believing France had brought stability and progress to the region, never knowing that it had also brought radiation, deformity, and death. The documents, which Traoré now insists are being recovered and digitized, tell a story far darker than previously imagined. Declassified reports speak of exposure radius testing, post-detonation troop observation, and African battalion participation. But nowhere are the names of those men preserved. No records, no graves, no apologies. And so the question arises, was this merely a byproduct of reckless testing, or something deeper? Was there a belief in Paris that African lives were worth less? That their suffering useful if it remains invisible? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Traoré says the answer lies in the silence, the deliberate erasure of events too ugly to fit the colonial narrative. It wasn't just military secrecy, it was a moral burial. Today, for the first time, that silence is breaking. Burkina Faso has begun compiling testimonies from descendants of the survivors. Laws are being drafted to demand reparations and official acknowledgement. And in schools across the country, plans are underway to include this hidden history in the national curriculum. But Traoré's point is not just to remember the past, it's to understand the psychology of the empire. If the West could do that, then, if it could justify burning the bodies of its so-called allies for data, what is it still capable of doing now with subtler tools and more polished words? As he put it, they tested bombs on our bodies, then they tested lies in our minds. And that leads us to the next weapon Traoré has exposed, not one dropped from planes, but broadcast into homes. If France once used bombs to scorch African bodies beneath the desert sun, what followed was far more subtle and far more lasting. According to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the second phase of colonial warfare didn't require soldiers or detonators. It required broadcasters, wires, satellites, and a message so carefully crafted that millions of Africans would internalize it without even realizing it came from an enemy. What he revealed was not just a media critique, it was a blueprint of manipulation. While the physical era of colonization ended with independence flags and broken chains, France, he argues, never truly let go. Instead, it shifted its strategy. It invaded a different terrain, the mind. At the center of this psychological battlefield were two seemingly harmless weapons, Radio France Internationale RFI and France 24. Both entered African homes as news outlets, but Traoré now calls them something else entirely: narrative control systems. Their mission, he claims, was never to inform, but to influence. Not to reflect reality, but to edit it, slowly, deliberately, until African audiences saw themselves through the eyes of their former rulers. He says it began with tone. When African leaders defied Western interests, they were framed as unstable, dangerous, or radical. When Western troops entered African soil, it was packaged as peacekeeping. When French companies extracted resources, it was investment. But when Africans protested, it became unrest. Bit by bit, over decades, a new worldview was programmed, one in which Africa was always in need of guidance, and France was always the guiding hand. Traoré describes his awakening. As a young man, he grew up absorbing this coverage. He remembers thinking that France was the center of logic and order, and that his people were trapped in chaos. He studied the vocabulary of global media, the clean, clinical language that made imperialism sound like assistance. But the more he lived, the more cracks he saw. Coverage of coups would ignore the causes. Reports on insurgency would erase the roots. He began to see a pattern. The West was always justified, and Africans were always blamed. And then came the moment that changed everything. Traoré recalls watching international news coverage after French troops were expelled from Mali. The tone, he said, was not one of curiosity or balance. It was one of scolding. It was as if a slave had run away, and the master was shocked, he said. That was the day he stopped trusting the feed. This, he argues, is why French media had to be banned from Burkina Faso. Not because of censorship, but because the most dangerous kind of war is the one that convinces the victim he is free. In Traoré's words, they conquered us once with force. Then they kept us conquered with stories. Since then, Burkina Faso has launched its public broadcasting overhaul, creating newsrooms grounded in local language, culture, and ownership. But Traoré insists this isn't about propaganda. It's about sovereignty. No nation, he says, can call itself independent if it doesn't own its narrative. If the tongue used to describe its reality belongs to another, then the mind can never be truly its own. And so the question arises, if France used stories to make Africa forget its scars, what other illusions have been carefully stitched into the African psyche? What other truths have been sold as progress, aid, and partnership? To answer that, Traoré turned next to the empire's most seductive tool of all, money. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It started, he explains, with the illusion of partnership. The International Monetary Fund (IMF), the World Bank, and countless Western-backed agencies arrived with briefcases full of promises, loans for infrastructure, grants for governance, and consultations for growth. But what they offered with one hand, they took back with the other. Because every dollar came wrapped in conditions. And those conditions were never neutral. Traoré argues that these financial institutions were never built to help Africa grow, but to ensure it grew in the direction Western powers preferred. Want a loan? Then cut subsidies, privatize your water, slash spending on your farmers. Let Western consultants rewrite your budget. Let foreign corporations bid on your natural resources. These were the terms. Countries desperate for stability sign, and with every signature, a little more sovereignty evaporated. He calls it the debt web, and once a nation is inside it, it rarely escapes. The money doesn't flow toward the people, it loops back toward the lender. Loans are issued for projects that employ foreign companies. Interest payments consume budgets meant for schools. Emergency bailouts come with restructuring demands that benefit foreign investors. Entire governments are reshaped not by elected leaders, but by terms drafted in offices thousands of miles away. Burkina Faso, like many African nations, once followed this path. But under Traoré, the brakes have been slammed. He has rejected IMF conditions outright and publicly declared that Africa no longer needs validation from Washington or Brussels. Instead, he insists it needs to reclaim its wealth and its ability to decide how that wealth is used. The turning point came when Traoré reviewed the balance sheets. Billions had flowed through the country in the name of aid, yet Burkina Faso remained poor, dependent, and externally governed. The pattern was clear. Resources went out: gold, cotton, energy. Debt came in. Western consultants flew first class to train local officials. Meanwhile, Burkinabe workers labored in mines owned by foreign shareholders. This wasn't development. This was drainage under the banner of partnership. So Traoré flipped the script. By the way, we have launched merch that honors the African leaders who are taking a stand for Africa. Check them out. To show you also stand with loyal sons of Africa, no matter where you are. Instead of exporting raw gold, Burkina Faso began building refineries. Instead of relying on foreign food imports, the government invested in agro-industrial projects with local cooperatives. Defense spending, once underwritten by French assistance, is being redirected into local production. It is not easy, but it is independent. Critics have warned of isolation. Traoré dismisses them. He says the real isolation was living inside a global system that fed off Africa's suffering while pretending to save it. "We don't want aid," he once said. "We want control over what's already ours." The rejection of IMF and World Bank assistance was more than a fiscal policy. It was a declaration of war on the softest, most deceptive form of imperialism. Because unlike guns or propaganda, money wears a smile. It speaks in diplomatic tones. It comes with suits and PowerPoints and polite applause. But at its core, Traoré insists that money is a leash, and his mission now is to break it. Yet the fight is not only about numbers and contracts. For him, the next battle is even deeper, one rooted in how Africans see themselves, their past, and their power. If financial colonization is about control of decisions, cultural colonization is about control of identity. And that's the next war Traoré is waging, one against the very rewriting of African history. When a nation loses control of its economy, the effects are felt in the present. But when it loses control of its memory, the wound is deeper. It forgets what it once was, and worse, it accepts what it has been told to be. According to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this is the most dangerous battlefield of all. The mind's archive, the classroom, the museum, the language of the past. And here he says, France fought its longest and most devastating war, a war to control how Africa remembers itself. Long after the treaties were signed and the flags lowered, colonial administrators left behind something more enduring than physical infrastructure. They left behind entire systems of education, culture, and historical framing designed to favor Europe's version of African reality. In Burkina Faso, as in many former colonies, children grew up memorizing French historical events, studying European philosophers, and learning about the civilizing mission that justified colonial rule. The resistance movements of Africa, reduced to footnotes, the brutality of colonization, sanitized, the heroes of the soil, ignored, renamed, or recast as rebels. Traoré says this wasn't an oversight, it was designed. France understood that you can only truly dominate a people when you dominate their sense of who they are. So it rewrote African history to begin not with empires, kings, and scientific thought, but with poverty, tribalism, and dependence. Slavery wasn't presented as genocide, it was explained as trade. Colonization wasn't an invasion, it was development. And African resilience wasn't portrayed as brilliance, it was labeled as chaos. This, Traoré argues, is why even decades after independence, many African elites still speak about Europe with awe and about their people with doubt. They wear foreign suits to declare sovereignty. They quote Rousseau to lead African parliaments. They build universities where the curriculum still begins with Plato, but not with Sundiata. The colonizer may have gone physically, but mentally, he never left. To fight this, Traoré has launched what he calls a cultural reliberation project. It began not in parliaments but in schools. The national curriculum is being overhauled to reflect the true scope of African civilization. Children are learning about the Mossi kingdoms, the reign of Askia Muhammad, the mathematics of ancient Mali, and the oral epics passed down before European ink touched a single African scroll. History is no longer a European narration, it's a homecoming. But this revival isn't limited to textbooks. In official ceremonies, Western dress codes are being replaced with traditional Burkinabe attire. Colonial statues are being removed from public squares, and in their place, monuments are being erected to local legends, ancestral leaders, and freedom fighters who resisted imperial domination. National holidays are being reassessed. Language policies are shifting to include and empower indigenous dialects long pushed aside in favor of French. This is not nostalgia, Traoré insists. This is a reconstruction of dignity, of continuity, of truth. Because without a memory of greatness, Africa was taught to settle for survival. And without pride in its own story, it was vulnerable to any outsider offering identity in exchange for submission. The reaction has been emotional. Across Burkina Faso, elders who once whispered forbidden stories now speak openly. Youth who once looked outward for meaning are turning inward for purpose. And regional allies are beginning to adopt similar reforms, signaling that this cultural correction may become a continental wave. But Traoré knows that rewriting history is not enough. Memory must be protected. Identity must be lived. And for that, Africa cannot stand alone. It must stand together. Which brings us to the final piece of his strategy: the formation of a united front against Western domination, not just culturally, but geopolitically. Once people have reclaimed their memory, rejected the puppet strings of debt, and silenced the voices that lied to them, there remains only one question: what comes next? Captain Ibrahim Traoré's answer is simple, but radical. Build an alliance strong enough to ensure the chains can never return. This is not a theory. It's already happening. And it's taking shape in the form of the Alliance of Sahel States AES, a rising geopolitical force designed not just to defend territory, but to reinvent sovereignty itself. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations that for decades were referred to in Western discourse as fragile, unstable, or dependent, are now setting the tempo of Africa's anti-colonial resurgence. Traoré, alongside leaders like Mali's Assimi Goïta and Niger's Abdourahmane Chiani, is crafting something entirely new: a post-Western African defense and development bloc. It's not merely a treaty. It's not just a military pact. It's a declaration that Africa no longer needs intermediaries to negotiate its destiny. The AES was born in fire. All three member states experienced regime changes that ousted pro-Western administrations, quickly followed by the expulsion of French troops, termination of military accords, and seizure of foreign-held assets. Critics in Paris and Washington labeled it a regression. But in the Sahel, it felt like revival. People didn't pour into the streets to protest the changes. They danced. They waved national flags. They painted murals of their new leaders as liberators. For them, this wasn't instability. It was released. Traoré's vision for the alliance goes far beyond symbolism. In closed-door meetings and public addresses, he has outlined plans for joint military training academies, shared agricultural infrastructure, and interlinked transport corridors that would allow the Sahel nations to bypass dependence on Western-controlled ports and trade routes. There are even discussions of a shared currency, one that would allow these nations to break free from the grip of the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency still printed in France and overseen by the French treasury. Perhaps most audacious is Traoré's call for an African defense industry that builds its arms, trains its officers, and monitors its skies. He believes it's possible. He believes the days of begging for drones and bulletproof vests from NATO warehouses must end. He believes African soil must no longer be protected by foreign boots that answer to foreign parliaments. The alliance is already coordinating intelligence sharing and cross-border operations to combat insurgency. Ironically, the very issue Western troops claim to solve, but failed to contain. With local leadership, terrain knowledge, and popular support, these forces are reportedly more effective and less resented by the civilian population. In the long run, Traoré argues, Self-defense is the foundation of self-respect. But he's not naive. He knows the backlash is coming. Western governments are already hinting at sanctions. Some regional neighbors, still under heavy French or American influence, have condemned the alliance as destabilizing. But Traoré has made it clear. The time for approval seeking is over. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not breaking rules. They're building new ones. This unity is not isolationist. It's invitational. Traoré has openly called for Guinea, Chad, and even distant African nations to consider joining or mirroring the AES model. The idea is to reshape the map, not in borders, but in purpose. A map where African nations negotiate trade, defense, and development with each other first, before consulting former colonizers. And so, from a region once written off as peripheral, a new core is forming. A core defined not by weakness, but by will. And at the center of it stands a generation of African leaders who are no longer asking for a seat at someone else's table. They are building their own. If a nation can be taught to forget its greatness, can it also be taught to reject its freedom? Let us know in the comments section. If Burkina Faso dares to reclaim its story, who else in Africa is ready to rise with it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching. Until the next video, stay tuned.